Iran's military infrastructure on the mainland is shattered. Now, the U.S. is turning its sights toward even more strategic targets, and Kharg Island is firmly in its crosshairs. This vital oil and military hub for Iran has been rocked as the U.S. rains downhill upon it. Iran is losing everything. The last thing keeping its regime alive is slipping from its grasp, and if the U.S. follows through, turning Kharg Island into a wasteland, Iran won't recover for years. To the average person, Kharg Island might not seem all that important. A small coral island nestled in the northern Persian Gulf. It lies about 55 kilometers or 34 miles northwest of the Iranian port of Bukhara. For a long time, it was uninhabited. But after Iran's oil and gas boom in the 20th century, Kharg Island became absolutely key to the country's oil-based prosperity. A crude oil terminal and massive loading facilities were built on the island in the 1960s. And by the mid-2020s, this tiny island had the capacity to load 10 supertankers simultaneously. Keep all of this oil business in mind. It'll be incredibly important later. But for now, that oil industry alone placed Kharg Island firmly on the U.S. map as a strategic location worthy of consideration for attack. Throw in some significant military facilities, which we'll also cover, and you have an island that is much more than meets the eye. The U.S. knew its significance, and on the night of March 13th, the announcement came. The U.S. had attacked. Targeted strikes rocked the entire island. U.S. President Donald Trump declared on March 13th. The focus, he explained in a Truth Social post, was squarely on the military targets moments ago at my direction. The United States Central Command executed one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East and totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Kharg Island. He added that the U.S. had left itself a little leverage by supposedly leaving Kharg's oil facilities untouched. But Trump's mention of the island as Iran's crown jewel immediately raises obvious questions. What makes Kharg Island so important? And if not oil, what did the U.S. actually hit? We'll deal with the second of these questions first. Militarily, Kharg Island is a surprisingly strategic target. As the Washington Post reports, the island is home to an air airstrip in its northeastern corner. Theoretically, this could be used by Iran's Air Force to launch its aging fleet of fighter jets and airframes. But let's be realistic, that hasn't really been happening. Iran knows its old F-4s, F-5s, and Soviet air fighter jets belong in a museum, not an airspace contested by American F-35s and cutting-edge fourth-generation fighters. However, an airstrip can be used to launch Shahed drones. And Iran has been using its drones to attack targets across the Gulf region and in the Strait of Hormuz. Kharg Island is also home to several jetties that can be used for shiploading. The Washington Post adds surrounding the island is an entire network of military infrastructure built up to protect it based both on mainland Iran and on several other small islands. So right now, at least bombing Kharg Island into oblivion is about taking out military targets that Iran could use to threaten container and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The sheer size of the military buildup on Kharg Island may be even bigger than the Washington Post indicates. As the BBC reports, U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, has claimed that the U.S. hit more than 90 Iranian military targets on Kharg Island while preserving the oil infrastructure. According to FAIRS, which the BBC reports as a semi-official news agency in Iran, air defenses, a helicopter hangar, an airport control tower, and a naval base were among these 90 targets. You would expect such an attack to have caused widespread casualties, but Iran is claiming that isn't the case. Deputy Governor of Behr Province, Ihsan Jianon, has claimed that no military personnel, oil company employees, or island residents suffered casualties in the attack, and all sectors are continuing their routine activities. How true that is, at least on the military side, is yet to be seen. But on the oil front, Kharg Island does indeed appear to be untouched. That's not because the U.S. couldn't hit the oil infrastructure. It chose not to. And as we'll explain in a few moments, there's a big reason why the U.S. left Kharg Island's oil unscathed. Let's truly home in on that oil for a moment. The real reason Trump refers to Kharg Island as the crown jewel of Iran is that it's the source of a staggering amount of the Iranian regime's income. Why? Because of its status as an oil terminal, Iran is a country rich in oil and gas. It holds about 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, the BBC says, which were estimated at 28.6 billion barrels back in 2014. Throw 15% of the world's proven gas reserves into the mix, and you see why an island specifically developed to handle these precious resources could become a crown jewel. Kharg Island is connected to the Iranian mainland by a pipeline that pumps gallons upon gallons of crude oil onto the island every single day. About 90% of Iran's crude oil flows through the terminal built on Kharg Island, transported through pipes from the mainland. And then there are the tankers. Massive supertankers, each capable of carrying up to 85 million gallons of oil, can sail right up to the island via its long jetties to pick up the incoming oil. This is possible because the island is positioned in deep waters that allow these behemoth tankers to stay afloat. Those same tankers wouldn't be able to access Iran's oil from ports on the mainland, making Kharg Island the key to Iran shipping huge quantities of its black liquid gold out of its territory and into the hands of its buyers. Most of those tankers immediately head out of Kharg Island and into the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran controls. Then they're off to wherever they need to go, which is typically China, as that country is Iran's biggest oil customer. Reuters reports that over 80% of the oil Iran ships goes to this one client, amounting to 1.38 million barrels per day. In its short primer on the relationship between Iran and China, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission estimated that Iran likely sells its crude oil to China at a discount of $9 below the 2025 benchmark of $69 per barrel. Some quick math tells us that this means Iran generates about $82.8 million from its oil daily just through sales to China. Expand that to an entire year, and Iran makes over $30.2 billion from selling to China alone. And remember, 90% of that crude oil flows through Kharg Island. That is Kharg Island's true importance to the Iranian regime. Losing the military infrastructure to the U.S. bombing raid will certainly sting. It weakens Kharg Island's defenses and also means that any effort Iran makes to use the islands to maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz is minimized. But it's the oil that is Iran's true problem. It serves as leverage for the U.S., a looming threat from the Trump administration that it could come back at any time and take away the one thing that is keeping Iran alive. But the U.S. hasn't gone that far with Kharg Island. Before we explain why and how doing so would change everything for Iran, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you want more insight as we break it down like this every single week. Now, Iran's crown jewel. Why hasn't the U.S. hit its oil infrastructure yet? Some might argue that taking out Kharg Island's military infrastructure is the U.S. priority, and that may well be the case as its bombers and fighter jets continue to wreck the Iranian regime's military posture. But according to Trump himself, not attacking Kharg Island's oil was less a strategic choice and more a choice made out of what he claims to be decency. Our weapons are the most powerful and sophisticated that the world has ever known. But for reasons of decency, I have chosen not to wipe out the oil infrastructure on the island, Trump proclaimed in the same Truth Social post where he announced the U.S. strike. And indeed, as the BBC reports, Janin claims that the process of exporting oil from the island is fully underway in the wake of the U.S. strike, and that the oil companies based on the islands have been able to continue their operations without interruption. But there's a reason for that. And if you stick with us to the end, you'll discover that one of those reasons has something to do with the possibility that the U.S. may have identified Kharg Island as the first place where it will put boots on the ground in Iran if the war escalates that far. First, the American decision to leave Kharg Island's oil infrastructure alone isn't so much about the decency Trump claims, but is instead about the U.S. having leverage over Iran. Trump made that much clear in his Truth Social post immediately after making the claim about decency. However, should Iran or anyone else do anything to interfere with the free and safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, I will immediately reconsider this decision. Trump said that's what it's really all about, protecting the Strait of Hormuz and trying to bring some stability back to an oil sector that has seen prices skyrocket since the U.S. launched Operation Epic Fury. On the latter front, the U.S. has been less than successful. On March 16th, The Guardian reported that oil prices had climbed again in the wake of the U.S. demolishing the military infrastructure on Kharg Island. Brent crude, which is the international benchmark for crude oil prices, rose by 1.8%. 8% during early trading on March 16th, hitting $94.98 per barrel after having already topped $100 the previous week for the first time since Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. This could be seen as an initial aftershock of the Kharg Island strike that will settle down if Iran listens to Trump's threats about future attacks if Iran doesn't leave the Strait of Hormuz alone. But right now, Iran may be wondering why it would want to change course at all. Its regime is doing very well from these oil price increases. The Financial Times reports that Iran has been loading between 1.5 and 1.6 million barrels of crude oil onto tankers daily since Operation Epic Fury began, which represents about 140 million per day of revenue due to the increased price of oil. And that's even with Iran's discount supplied. Perhaps that's why Trump has claimed that the U.S. may yet choose to take out Kharg Island's oil infrastructure just for fun. As The Guardian reports, behind the bravado is a clear problem emerging. Kharg Island, even after the initial wave of attacks, is still allowing Iran to generate enormous sums of money that are even larger than they would have been if the U.S. had never attacked. Still, the U.S. has the trump card pun slightly intended of future strikes. But whether it plays that card comes down to what happens with the Strait of Hormuz in the coming days. As Trump made clear, convincing Iran to leave that key waterway alone was the reason why the U.S. destroyed Kharg Island's military infrastructure. That strait is the largest piece of leverage that Iran has. About 20% of the world's oil supplies transit the Strait of Hormuz every year, and losing it means that tankers have to take much longer routes to their destinations. Hence the oil price shocks that we've seen in the wake of Operation Epic Fury. Right now, the U.S. is holding off. Despite these price shocks, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said that what we're seeing from Iran right now is more desperation than the application of leverage. As the world is seeing, they are exercising sheer desperation in the Strait of Hormuz. Hegseth claimed during a March 13th briefing ahead of the U.S. attacking Kharg Island. He added, "It's something we're dealing with. We've been dealing with it. Don't need to worry about it." Hegseth also suggested that there is no evidence that Iran has been laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz, which would be another method through which it could disrupt shipping beyond drone and fast attack boats. Disruptions that in turn cause oil prices to continue to rise and Iran to profit through the very island that the U.S. has struck. The U.S. has struck against Iran's mine-laying ships, reportedly taking out 16 of them. So there is some firepower and action to back HGU's claims. However, commercial tanker and container shipping companies may not be so quick to agree with Hegseth that there is no need to worry in the Strait of Hormuz. Despite all of Hegseth's claims, attacks are ongoing in and around the waterway. On March 17th, the New York Times reported that a tanker anchored near a port in the United Arab Emirates had become the latest to be hit by a projectile since the beginning of the operation. Granted, that was the first strike on a commercial ship near the Strait of Hormuz in 5 days, the outlet adds. However, it comes in the wake of U.S. calls for its European allies to help secure the strait being roundly rebuffed, as it's now clear that those allies are wary of getting themselves dragged into a war that they believe has little to do with them outside of the oil issues it's causing. What this most recent attack tells us is that Iran hasn't taken Trump's warning to heart. The Strait of Hormuz still isn't clear for safe transit. And that brings us right back to Kharg Island and the trump card that the U.S. still has left to play. The military infrastructure on the island is gone. Next up, the island itself. Though Trump has threatened to strike Kharg Island's oil infrastructure, he may not do it in the way that many expect. More bombs and missiles flying into the island would certainly wreck Iran from an economic perspective. But it would also represent a massive escalation that could back Iran into such a tight corner that it starts striking like a rabid animal at anybody and everybody. Plus, destroying a key oil transit point like Kharg Island won't do much to help the oil price shocks that we're already seeing. So if the bombs are going to start flying to take out the oil infrastructure, what is the U.S. going to do instead? According to the Jerusalem Post, putting boots on the ground on Kharg Island is a distinct possibility. It claims that the U.S. is considering seizing the island from Iran if the country's regime and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps continue what they're doing in the Strait of Hormuz. Axios adds that the Trump administration has been discussing the seizure as far back as March 7th, which casts a whole new light on the initial strikes against Kharg Island. They were a threat to Iran, of course, but they may have also been an example of the U.S. laying the groundwork for a seizure that Iran will have no chance of stopping now that Kharg Island's military infrastructure is in ruins. The BBC says this seizure is a very distinct possibility. There is even a concept of operations or CONUP that has been drawn up covering how the U.S. might pull this off. A CONUP is essentially a document that details different courses of action that can be taken for a country to achieve its military goals. And so far, it looks like the U.S. has checked off most of the boxes that we can assume would go into that CONUP. The island's air defenses have been suppressed during the initial attack. We know that the U.S. can gather as much intelligence as it needs through flyovers conducted by fighter jets, helicopters, and drones such as the MQ-9 Reaper. What the U.S. has to figure out now is how it's actually going to get troops onto the island and how those troops would suppress enemy fire and ultimately take Kharg Island away from Iran. The BBC suggests that Delta Force might be the go-to operators for the U.S. It posits a scenario in which Delta Force flies in on helicopters that take off from the coast of Kuwait. That journey would take 70 minutes. Add loiter time, and you get 3 hours of flight, which brings refueling into play. Air-to-air refueling would have to be done as Iran could attempt to contaminate fuel on the ground. The outlet adds this aerial approach would overcome many of Iran's strategies, which include the use of ballistic missiles, anti-H-ship missiles, and mines placed around the coast of Kharg. But it would be vulnerable to drones, especially as Iran would have more than an hour to prepare for the coming of the U.S. Special Operations Forces. But maybe there's another way, and far from being speculative, this method is one that the U.S. seems to be actively preparing to execute. As we speak, a deployment of about 2,500 U.S. Marines is heading to the Middle East as part of an amphibious assault group that includes the USS Tripoli warship. Those Marines are part of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. These units are America's all-purpose forces. They go in and solve problems, whether that be crisis resolution or, as was the case during the war against Afghanistan in 2001, serving as the first boots placed on the ground by the U.S. in a wider conflict. Now, if Hexath is correct, and there is no evidence that Iran has been laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz or elsewhere, an amphibious landing on Kharg Island becomes possible. And what we might be seeing is that the U.S. is prepping its Marine Expeditionary Unit so that it's ready to make that landing if Iran doesn't take America's threats related to the Strait of Hormuz seriously. However, 2,500 Marines may not be enough. According to Francis Galano, a security specialist at Villanova University, the taking of Kharg Island would involve moving a considerable number of ground combat troops into the region. I estimate about 5,000 to take and hold the island. The U.S. is sending half that number to the Middle East. Maybe more could be coming. And if they are, Iran has a major problem. The U.S. bombing the Kharg Island oil infrastructure would be bad enough. But if the U.S. takes the island, Iran still loses its ability to sell its oil, and it has to deal with an escalation the likes of which it can't counter. Kharg Island has been set up for just such an occupation. Its military infrastructure is gone. The U.S. has the air power needed to suppress Iran's military on the surrounding islands and on the mainland. With the loss of Kharg Island, Operation Epic Fury would truly begin to squeeze the Iranian economy, placing the regime in the difficult position of trying to fight as the oil money that is Iran's main lifeline runs out. What happens next on Kharg Island could determine the fate of Iran's regime, and that regime is already struggling to contain America's responses to its actions in the Strait of Hormuz. After Iran hit 3 merchant ships in that waterway, the U.S. responded with attacks that crippled the regime's naval assets in hours. Find out more about the brutal U.S. strikes in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to Brief Update to stay up to date on the latest developments in Operation Epic Theory. And thank you as always for watching.